Okay, Suzanne, thanks so much for doing this. My first question that I have for you is tell the audience, just a little bit about yourself and how you started, in the just kind of like your background and how you sort of not only your upbringing, but also kind of like how you started in mental health.
Mental health? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, hello, my name is Susan Abdel-Haq. I'm a licensed MFT. I've been in practice since 2019. Um, I have a virtual practice out in Los Angeles, and I work with individuals who struggle with, complex PTSD, anxiety, substance use, just, navigating their cultural identities. I do a lot of work with the LGBTQ plus community as well. Um, and I just do a lot of work as far as like relational trauma. Um, I'm trained in brain spotting, EMDR, so I tend to take a very trauma-informed approach when I work with clients. Um, Having said that, I like to integrate, different modalities of therapy. As far as just kind of my background, um, so, I grew up as a second generation immigrant, Palestinian. I grew up in Ventura County where, we were the minority. And, I noticed that I kind of struggle with very unique challenges that I felt like a lot of my peers maybe didn't quite understand, or even my teachers growing up. Um, just navigating kind of how to integrate my cultural identity, expectations from family that were more traditional, trying to fit in, in just greater American culture. And I also had a lot of anxiety. I had a lot of anxiety. Now that I look back, I may have been a little neurodivergent, as far as learning at times. Um, it was kind of a struggle for me to catch on, just even in school at times. And, looking back, I think there was a lot of pieces or layers that were contributing to that. And, I had gone to therapy, as when I was younger, right? Because teachers were picking up on the fact that I was kind of a little slower with certain subjects. And I always felt like they didn't quite grasp kind of just my experience, my unique kind of challenges. And I've always been really interested in psychology. Like, I always like to kind of understand, people's stories and kind of why they were that they were the way that they were. And also, um, just within, in the Arab community, there isn't a lot of therapists or people that, go into this field because there's still a lot of shame and stigma, that, is slowly being, challenged. But at the time, it was still very new. Um, so I think one of the biggest reasons is that, I wanted to provide more representation for my community as far as more Arab therapists just being in the field, and also, providing more access, right, for clients that maybe come from, that are maybe second generation, first or second generation, and want to find a therapist that they feel that that maybe understands a little bit more their unique challenges. Um, and yeah, so I went to UCSB for my bachelor's. I majored in psychology, and I also always wanted to help people. So I felt like psychology, helping people, therapy, it just
Mm-hmm.
sense to me. Um, and yeah, and then I got my master's from Pepperdine. I majored in clinical psychology, and then, started working towards my hours, my licensing hours. And I've worked in a variety of settings. I worked at a school. I've worked mostly in treatment centers. So that's why kind of one of my specialties is substance use, because I've worked in a lot of inpatient and outpatient. And again, with substance use, there's usually trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just a lot of pieces, a lot of layered pieces that play a role in that. So yeah, I've just been pretty exposed to a wide variety of presenting issues and being in different settings. And yeah, now I'm just settled in private practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I want to touch on something that you referenced earlier, which is because I know I saw on one of your videos you were talking to this therapist about sort of when it comes to therapy, there are sort of these um, you know, cultural sort of differences that people are struggling with. So like how do you as a therapist, how do you how do you sort of help clients, with identity and kind of their struggles with that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's important that therapists have at least some general knowledge that just kind of the way that therapy is framed may not always work with certain clients, especially if clients come from a more collectivistic, culture and have their family dynamics might be a little different. So I know for me, I think what's really helpful for clients is really just being curious and really trying to understand their unique story. And maybe trying to help them navigate what's helped them and what hasn't, as opposed to what the therapist assumes would be helpful. So, for example, a big piece, especially working with Arab clients, and I'm sure other communities, is navigating family, right? Expectation, very maybe more rigid, maybe at times expectations of family and culture, and helping clients piece out what pieces they want to maybe retain and maybe what aspects maybe don't work for them. But also just understanding the challenge of that, right? So, for example, you know, when it comes to dating, let's say, dating and, you know, having parents that maybe have an old way of perceiving that process, right? Like, they might have certain expectations of maybe the type of partner, their kids are supposed to have, maybe someone that's more within their culture or more traditional. Whereas the client, living in the US, that just may not work for them in some aspects. But again, we don't want to assume either, right? So we want to always bring it back to the client, what feels aligned with them and having them really tap in viscerally with that, instead of just assuming. And also another big thing is, just in Arab culture, a lot of times adult children, this idea that after you're 18, you get to just be whatever you want,
Hmm.
that doesn't really work. They don't know what that means a lot of the times. So it's like, family still has a say or plays a big part. And there's a lot of, I know, shame, guilt in obviously wanting to please parents, right? But at the same time, wanting to honor what feels right for them. And there's a lot of grief, anxiety, in trying to navigate that. And it's not as easy as just do what you want and that's it, right? That doesn't, it's a process for them. So yeah, and sometimes you may integrate the family, right? Family therapy is very common. So
Hmm.
maybe having the mom or the dad, come into sessions and maybe trying to explain, because that there's also a disconnect there where sometimes the parents who are first generation, they are not quite understanding the internal process that their kids are going through with having to obviously respect their culture that they came in with, along with trying to integrate in the US, and explaining that to them is important too.
Hmm. It's sort of this yeah, I get your point. It's also like this have you ever seen the movie You People? It's basically sort of this movie where there are these two families that come together, and then the guy being from a white family, and then an African American the girlfriend being an African American family, and then those two families sort of clash, and they have to settle out their differences between class, race, all that kind of stuff. So it really encapsulates what we're just talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, yeah, that is a great example of that, and it is a challenge, but I think just obviously understanding that that is a very real thing. And yeah, that is.
Let's dive into that further. Like what are some of the hesitancies, like that people may have with dating someone of a different, cultural background? What are some of the, could you talk a little bit about that, give an insight into that as to,
Yeah. Yeah, so are you talking specifically like within like maybe Arab or Palestinian
right.
like yeah, okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think a big piece is, obviously some families are a little bit more open than others, so just understanding that there is a variation, there's a spectrum, right? Again, some are more open and kind of understand that is a very real possibility, right? And then there's families that are a little bit more traditional. But I would say, this is especially big for Muslim families, people who are more, because Arabs and Palestinians, there's Muslims, there's Christians, that it's varied as far as religion. But if we talk about like Muslims specifically, I know a big piece is obviously there's a lot of gender differences, right? So traditional, like culturally, right? Generally, I'm speaking in a very general sense, males, right? Men, there tends to be more of an openness for them to date outside of their background, right? Um, as opposed to women, especially if they come from a Muslim background, just in the religion it says that, a Muslim woman has to be with a Muslim man. So, that can pose some challenges if, let's say, a Muslim woman meets someone who doesn't come from a Muslim background. Sometimes there is, that is a conversation, right? Of whether he's going to convert, if that is even okay with the family, right? Again, some families are more open to people marrying someone who is converting as opposed to maybe someone who already comes from that background. Um, and also, just navigating if that isn't something that their partner is going to do, right? And, again, in some cases, the Muslim woman or the person may just kind of go with their heart and kind of what works for them. And that poses a challenge, right? And that could lead to a lot of friction, within the family. And then other times it all works out, right? Um, so that's a very unique and very common thing that that I hear about, whether it's, within my clients or just from what I see just within my community. Um, but I think it depends on how traditional the family is, um, and how much they understand that in the US, you meet people of all backgrounds, right? So this expectation that you meet, if you're an Arab Muslim woman and you're gonna meet another Arab Muslim man just kind of organically, that's harder if you're in the US, right? But that's why a lot of times, the family gets, if someone's ready to get married traditionally, right, whether it's the woman or the man, the family tends to, we tend to be very close-knit community. So people will ask around, like, hey, do you know someone for my daughter? Or do you know someone for my son? And it's kind of like this matchmaking aspect too, that is still very common. Um, and there's also dating apps, obviously, I mean, with any community, right? If you're Jewish and you want to meet a Jewish partner, there's apps, right? So that's also another thing too that Muslim clients or Muslim people have is that there's a lot of dating apps for that. Um, and even Arab Christian, like again, it's like the more specific you want, I'm sure there's an app for that where you can find that if that is something that is important to you.
Because that's what I was gonna ask. Like, how does that how does what we're talking about translate into what you hear from clients in your private practice? What are some of the themes that you sort of here around dating and finding and sort of navigating this whole idea of um finding someone that has a different cultural background than you. What have you heard from clients that you've worked with?
Just like with clients who maybe have met people that of different cultural backgrounds.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I think a big piece is there's definitely a hesitancy with introducing them right away or letting the family know. So that's a big piece too, is there is this secrecy, unfortunately, where, clients feel like they have to really conceal that aspect of themselves, right? When it comes to like their love life, right? That isn't
Hmm.
something that they feel comfortable just being so open about, especially with family, depending on how open or traditional they might be. So that's something that clients will come in with as far as like, hey, they're really starting to like someone or they see it becoming serious and wanting to navigate, how do I bring this up, knowing that my mom or dad, may not approve of this right away, or there might be a very strong reaction to that. So that's a big piece. But also when they do know, it's an adjustment, it's not just for the client, it's an adjustment for the family because, coming from an Arab culture, um, it is very much about reputation. There is a lot of emphasis on family honor and reputation, and if your kids, and again, this is more general and more traditional. It's not everyone, right?
Hmm.
Definitely, there's a lot of families that have steered out of that or have kind of broken out of that. But this idea of like, oh, my daughter is, marrying or going out with someone who isn't Palestinian or isn't Arab, right? And what does that make, what does that do? What does that make me look like? Like that shame, there's aspects of that shame and that like how accepted that would be even within the whole community, right? Not just the immediate family. So for my clients, they understand this and they carry a lot of that guilt because they don't want that for their family. But at the same time, they like someone and they want to be with someone and they may not really agree with some of that because again, the US tends to be more individualistic, the culture
Right.
overall. So it's like they're trying to find that balance or how are they going to please everyone in this situation? So that's definitely something that I see a lot.
Yeah, and so like what do you do as a therapist to sort of help them with those relationship struggles that we've talked about, these cultural differences and like yeah.
Cultural differences. Yeah, so I think for me, I just I provide space for that. I mean, some of it is just accepting that this is the situation. These are the feelings that are going to come with that. So I usually just really try to validate that because it is real, right? It is a very real feeling, right? It is very real. I'll have them kind of sit with it. I'll just kind of be with them and have them accept that these are possibilities, right? Depending on their family, there is a possibility of their parents not being so open or maybe having a certain reaction to that and helping them navigate, okay, if that does happen, how are you going to deal with that? Right? How are you going to sit with that? Right? Whether it's, getting more support, whether it's, sometimes there's other family members, that's also another thing that I like to emphasize and which kind of makes them like really know that I truly get them is I'm like, you know what? Maybe there's an uncle in your family that's more open-minded that can talk to your family or that could maybe help ease some of that tension, right? So I sometimes like to use because again, if our culture is very family oriented, right? And there's that closeness, why not use that to your advantage, right? Why not use that to maybe help the situation, right? And that is a common thing is that sometimes when there is these issues, right? Sometimes other family members will try to mediate or bridge the gap. So I will, suggest that and see if that's something that is there. But really, I always also bring it back to like, well, what are your values? What is it that you believe? What is important to you? And how can you stay true to that? What would that look like for you? Because again, every person is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just like to meet them where they're at based on what feels really aligned. And yeah, and that might mean not making everyone happy. And how do we sit with that discomfort and navigate that? So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's usually it, and sometimes a big piece to this is that there isn't like one solution, right? One fix it. Okay, just do this and everything is gonna work out. It's sometimes it's just being in that discomfort with them. And that I find can be very helpful, very therapeutic.
Mm-hmm. I always ask therapists this, like what have you learned in doing this kind of work with the Arab Muslim community?
Like, what are some things that I've learned?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, I think also a big piece, especially for me, is that because I am Arab Muslim, something that I've really learned and really grown to understand the more I've worked with these clients is still how much stigma there is, still how much stigma there is with even just seeking therapy. I think sometimes because I'm like, oh, well, I'm a therapist and I go to therapy. You know, I forget that not everyone is in that place. So sometimes even when I have clients that are new, it's a lot of just getting them used to the therapy, like getting them kind of settled into it, just used to talking to someone that they don't really know that well, helping them navigate expectations of therapy and what therapy is and what therapy isn't. So again, I emphasize with clients that therapy is a process. It's not going to be we have one conversation and everything's going to click and you're going to know what to do, right? And I'm not going to tell you that either, right? A lot of that is me guiding you so that you tap in and figure out what that is going to be for your life. And sometimes that takes time for the clients to understand and really grasp, so that can pose as a challenge at times, right? Because maybe they're expecting that I just tell them, okay, well, just do this. And, we just do a couple sessions and that's all it is. But it's like, if there's trauma, especially intergenerational trauma, that is a process and that is uncomfortable and that is going to take time. So that is something that I've had to learn to like remind myself because sometimes I assume that someone knows this or
Mm-hmm.
understands this, but no, that is something. Also for me, not to make assumptions, right? And not to project for me my transference of feeling like I know this person just because we come from the similar background.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's a spectrum, right? Some families operate a little still there's still differences, right? They're not even within Palestinian or Arab or Muslim families, there's still differences, right? Like for example, even with my friends, like I have like my Arab Muslim friends, their parents sometimes do operate very differently than my parents at times. So I have to remind myself of that, and that's something that I've definitely learned. Um, and just really understanding the deeper layers of that intergenerational trauma, whether it's war trauma, whether it's other aspects, right? Identity, um, the impact of racism, right? And also kind of also this piece of what we're told about Arabs and Muslims, right? It's like there's a layer where we do internalize that, you know, and that can cause a lot of anxiety and shame. So getting clients to really understand that too, just to make better sense of their symptoms is something that I've had to learn. And Yeah, and just the guilt and the shame around maybe breaking out of certain norms or out of the mold of what you're supposed to be. That's also something.
Mm-hmm. And what do you hope to learn in terms of something new as a mental health therapist? What's on your bucket list?
On my bucket list.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm trained in brain spotting, trained in EMDR. Um, I think something that I have really wanted to maybe delve deeper into, like, I mean, there's so much that I want to do, really. But one aspect is I noticed that within, especially Arab women, there's this aspect of almost a double life, and
Hmm.
this is something that I see with a lot of peers, friends, I see with a lot of my clients, is that challenge of having to conceal parts of themselves so heavily, right? Like, because it's not what is expected of an Arab woman. So that is something that I want to delve deeper into, whether it's maybe doing groups, or just maybe doing some writing around, because it is something that I see where it's like having to conceal parts of you that maybe are viewed a certain way or as shameful or as not okay, and the anxiety of almost leading a double life. Like only some people see one face of you, other people see a different face of you, and having to navigate that. I think that is definitely something. Um, and also just trying to make trauma informed practices more digestible and more culturally attuned to my community. Because sometimes, even with doing EMDR or brain spotting, certain things maybe don't land as much with certain clients, and
Hmm.
still trying to figure out, okay, what are maybe some of the missing pieces? What do I need to maybe refrain from? What do I maybe need to add? I mean, that's something that I definitely want to gain more understanding with for sure.
Hmm. And lastly, what tips, advice would you give to those who are wanting to go into the mental health field to really work with Arab and Muslim populations that may not necessarily come, co that they themselves might not necessarily identify themselves as? Because oftentimes, and I come this from a journalism background. I remember that we did like some sort of bingo card thing, and they basically taught us like, in order to really understand the community, you have to really do the research and sort of, especially for reporters that don't come from cultural backgrounds as the population I'm studying from. So like, how do you sort of net how can you apply that to the mental health context? Like for a
Yeah,
therapist that doesn't identify as an Arab Muslim, but who wants to work with clients who are Arab Muslim.
or Muslim, yeah, for sure. So I would say a big piece is just gain some just general knowledge about the culture, general knowledge about the culture, general knowledge about the region. So even something as simple as not all Arabs are Muslim, not all Muslims are Arab. You'd be surprised how many therapists make a lot of assumptions, right? They see someone, maybe I don't know, maybe it's hard maybe not to stereotype, or I don't know, where they assume that it's a monolith, right? It's all just the same. And, you'd be surprised, even me telling someone, hey, I'm Palestinian, they think Pakistan. So it's even just the general stuff, just the general knowledge, and I get it, you're not gonna maybe know everything, right? There's still a lot that I don't know. But just know, the difference between someone who is from Iran, someone who's from Iraq, Persian, Arab, just get acquainted with that there's different ethnic groups, and there is differences and similarities within those groups. So I think having just the general knowledge, um, and also seek consultation and supervision, right? Really learn from other Arab mental health professionals, if you ever have questions or if there's something that you're not sure about, seek support, right? I know for me, I'm always open to that. If, peers ask questions or like, I'm not sure, even if they're like, they feel bad, like, oh my gosh, should I know this? It's, it's okay, Um, Again, and also in grad school, I'll say there wasn't a lot of information working with this population. I didn't receive a lot of training on that. I remember when during our cultural class, working with people of different backgrounds, working with Arabs or Muslim clients was literally just a paragraph in a book, right? Very, and I don't even think my professor even elaborated on it. So, there's still a lot that needs to be done. And I hope to be part of that, right? As, a therapist, and whether it's, giving trainings, that's something that I do as well. I give a lot of trainings, working with these clients based on what I just personal lived experience and also professionally. Um, so be open to take some of those trainings and learn. Um, and also be careful not to make assumptions, right? Allow the client to tell you their story and be curious and be reflective, and that's the thing, that's the biggest piece is, with therapy, they say always go back to the biggest success in therapy comes back to the relationship that you have with your clients. So if your client feels comfortable and that you are taking the time to understand and hold that safe space for them, they're gonna really appreciate that and find benefit in that.
Mm-hmm. All right.